Heidegger is considered to be one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. In Being and Time, Heidegger shows us that an understanding of being is determined by a temporal framework. Being as presencing takes what is as something with which we can deal, something here and now, which we can literally grasp, turn to and fro, modify to suit our needs, and so forth. He then explains the historical change of being that took place along with the rise of Greek cultural practices. The world of myth and magic that preceded Greek culture used tools and rituals to invoke a dimension beyond, one that is hidden from view in a very different way than the way our involved use of tools lies behind the appearance of things as present at hand. He offers readers an account of the primordial beginning which launched Western culture on the path of metaphysics. His further writings propose a leap into a new way of being as radical as the appearance of metaphysics was for the Greeks 2,300 years ago. This exposition begins with his analysis of presencing. Presencing is the distinctive way the cultural past, present, and future are held together for us. Western culture has taken being as presencing in two senses. First, to be signifies presence at some here and now. And second, to be signifies something with which we could be involved or at home with in our everyday world. We take what is, again, something with which we can deal, something here and now, which we can literally grasp, turn to and fro, modify to suit our needs, and so forth. Heidegger observes that an object-oriented, that is, objective ontological context did not exist for earlier civilizations where connections between things were made by myth and magic, not practical everyday use. The Greek discovery of mind or subjectivity disclosed a collection of present-at-hand entities to be encountered by subjects as objective, as contrasted with imaginary or arbitrary. This subjectivity has the character of always already being in some current situation with the goals and practices and skills of others. In Time of Being, Heidegger argues that we must carefully distinguish two different senses of the phrase transformation of being. On one hand, there are the various transformations of being in the history of being as presencing, that is, the stages of metaphysics with their different conceptions of the being of what is. As an example of this, how early Greek philosophers arrive at the understanding of objects as fundamentally present at hand after initial, and Heidegger thinks original, recognition of the role of cultural practices and tool use in the formation of an understanding of being. The second sense of transformation of being is what we get when Heidegger writes his interpretation of the pre-theoretical conditions for there to be consciousness of objects. He is writing about how significant the change is when it is change in being itself. Much of Being and Time is about bringing about such a change, again, change like the shift from mythological culture to ontological culture. Particularly, a shift from an ontological culture to a culture informed by a new understanding of being as disposedness, as a way of life shared by the members of some community. The change in our experience of time from mythological to ontological was a change from cyclical to heteromorphic into the notion of a linear time made up of indexical nows. Religious practices and visionary events happen in a sacred time that can invoke the mythological past into the present, starting the cycle of seasons over again or telling people what they must do in everyday time. The present loops back to rejoin the reality of the past rather than, as in our view, marching steadily into an unknown future. In Heidegger's later work, the leap for which he calls is as radical as that of the primordial beginning, which launched this Western culture on the path of metaphysics. He sets out to uncover the basis for a new primordial beginning by adding a fourth dimension of meaning and significance to the temporality of ontological culture. He allows for a conceptual shift in the character of being. A shift from an I over and against objects with properties available to reason to a set of relations that have the character of being with, of our disposedness to a way of life shared by members of some community. He explains that the temporal disclosure of the domains of what is, such as nature, language, space, and humanity, themselves change. The transition from mythological cultures to metaphysics of presence occurred, in his view, in 3 steps. Society moved from nature myths to the intermediate stage of cultural myths, such as Homer's stories, to an orientation toward tools and the famous Greek discovery of mind, or subjectivity. This subjectivity was temporally disclosing the past, present, and future as gathered together by presencing. Presencing is the 4th dimension of time because it is a distinctive way the cultural past, present, and future are held together. What we first hear is never noises or complexes of sounds, but the creaking wagon, the motorcycle. We hear the column on the march, the north wind, the woodpecker tapping, fire crackling. It requires a very artificial and complicated frame of mind to hear a pure noise. The fact that motorcycles and wagons are what we proximately hear is the phenomenal evidence that in every case, Dasein, as being in the world, already dwells alongside what is ready to hand within the world. It does not dwell proximally alongside sensations, nor would it first have to give shape to the swirl of sensations to provide a springboard from which the subject leaps off and finally arrives at a world. Dasein is essentially understanding, taking place proximally alongside what is understood, which is the social norms and skills and goals of our culture. What the existential analytic has given us so far is a phenomenological description of Dasein's within the world encounters with entities. The next observation introduced is the notion of world and the associated withinness of Dasein. Heidegger focuses on Dasein's everydayness as a tool using social being in order to avoid the bias of any particular understanding of being, like being as presencing. He argues that we ordinarily encounter entities, what he calls equipment, that is, as being for certain sorts of tasks, cooking, writing, hair care, and so on. In encounters with entities, the world is something with which Dasein is already familiar. He is famous for the use of the analogy of a hammer. He describes an encounter with a hammer. While engaged in trouble-free hammering, the skilled carpenter has no conscious recognition of the hammer, the nails, or the workbench, in the way that one would if one simply stood back and thought about them. Tools in use become phenomenologically transparent. Not only are the hammer, nails, and workbench in this way not part of the engaged carpenter's phenomenal world, neither, in a sense, is the carpenter. The carpenter becomes absorbed in his activity in such a way that he has no awareness of himself as a subject over and against a world of objects. Crucially, it does not follow from his analysis that Dasein's behavior in such contexts is automatic, in the sense of there being no awareness present at all, but rather that the awareness that is present, what Heidegger calls circumspection, is non-subject-object in form. Phenomenologically speaking, there are no subjects and no objects. There is only the experience of the ongoing task, here, hammering. The essence of his criticism is that the experience of the ongoing task has a structure different from looking at the entity in question, or by some detached intellectual or theoretical study of it. We experience motorcycles and wagons of the world as understanding of our absorbed activity with them, our awareness of manipulating them in a hitch-free manner. He calls this way in which we experience a world as a totality of involvements, our ready-to-hand relationship to the world. Entities so encountered have their own distinctive totality of involvements. The theoretical attitude of pure presence is parasitical upon a more originary involvement with the world as a field of previously experienced totalities of involvement like hammers. The implication is that we all share an orientation to how things fit into an ongoing task structure based on their own unique experience as a totality of involvements. We encounter hammer not as something brown, heavy, and hard, but as something for hammering. Hammering is the sum total of manipulating it in a hitch-free manner. Thus, a driver does not encounter a punctured tire as a lump of rubber or measurable mass. She encounters it as a damaged item of equipment that is the cause of a temporary interruption in her driving activity. Heidegger sees that what stands out for us gains its opportunity to, out of its mutually belonging there, out of its having a familiarity with being. Heidegger sometimes uses the term dwelling to capture the distinctive manner in which Dasein is in the world. Dwell in a house is not merely to be inside it spatially, in the sense just canvassed. Rather, it is to belong there, to have a familiar place there. It is in this sense that Dasein is essentially in the world. We are in the world with a framework for skillfully manipulating it in a hitch-free manner. The less we just stare at a hammer, and the more we seize hold of it and use it, the more primordial does our relationship to it become. The more unveiled is it encountered as that which it is as equipment. The hammering itself uncovers the specific manipulability of the hammer, the kind of being which the equipment possesses, in which it manifests itself in its own right. He calls this ready to hand. His observations bring into view a blind spot in our understanding of relationships in the world, unrecognized in some 2,300 years of human history. He shows us a set of distinctions later taken up by pragmatists, in which the dualisms attached to our concepts of reality, reason, and nature have been fatally flawed. His observations about the objective and subjective features of reality and existence, the nature of ontology, open up a space within which pragmatists later go on about dissolving this long-held epistemological problem into the notion of a better human future. This post-Nietzschean branch of European philosophy and post-Darwinian philosophy includes Sartre, Gadamer, Derrida, and Foucault and James, Dewey, Quine, Putnam, Donald Davidson, and Richard Rorty. These thinkers are often described as anti-dualists. Taken together, they and Heidegger might say that the vocabulary in which the traditional problems of Western metaphysics are formulated were useful for a time, but are no longer. This move from the questions and vocabularies associated with appearance and reality to the more useful and less useful dissolves many of the traditional problems of epistemology in Western metaphysics. From this new point of view, these concerns with our mental representations adequately corresponding to the intrinsic nature of reality are false and dangerously false. Heidegger makes the argument that we should replace the idea that humans are minds working with representations of the world with the idea that we are language users, using our best developed tools, words, to cope with our environments. This shift from the Cartesian changes our understanding of words as representational to thinking of words as nodes in a causal network, binding us to our environments. This move from the representational to the causal is a central critique Heidegger puts forward. That Western tradition since Plato has held that to be is to be a substance, and that substances have properties. This way of thinking has shaped our self-conception as a mind trying to get in touch with a reality outside of itself. This has led to subjects and predicates and what is known as the predicate calculus. A table is a self-sufficient entity with properties inhering in it. It is brown, hard, heavy, and these properties, color, hardness, and weight, are also self-sufficient. Heidegger sees that this vocabulary does not capture the relatedness of our understanding. He sees that things are not atomistic in this way, but holistic. For us, everything is influenced by and depends on and could not be what it is except for everything else. This conception of substances is what Heidegger calls the present at hand way of being of substances. For the Western tradition, the study of being, ontology, has been structured in the form of the predicate calculus, the system in which everything can be described once you get all of the stories about all of the substances, and all the stories about all the properties, and how they are all related. Heidegger shows us a move from dualism to holism requires a different way of being in the world to account for the relatedness and situatedness of things. He calls this relatedness and situatedness the way of being of equipment, or the ready to hand. The way of being of equipment takes into account the place and the practices of a culture, and of things, and how something particular is related to all of the equipment and to all of the goals and the skills of people. A hammer, for instance, has an in order to hammer in nails. It has a towards which, a goal of holding boards in place, also a final towards which, say building a house for the sake of providing shelter or being a carpenter and so on. The way of being of equipment is what it is about equipment that makes it equipment, which is the holism and relatedness with our practices and our skills. All of this goes into what it is to be a hammer. A name he gives for the whole system of equipment is the ready-to-hand way of being. Pragmatists like William James, John Dewey, William Quine, Hilliard Putnam, Donald Davidson, and Richard Rorty also show us a move from dualism to holism. Their work also instructs us to replace the Cartesian vocabulary and notion that we are minds working with representations of the world with the notion that we are language users using our best developed tools, words, to cope with our environment. They share Heidegger's belief in the primacy of practical activity or coping. This observation about the failure of Cartesian substance ontology to deal adequately with the vast network of hammers and trains and tables and all sorts of equipment which are so basic to having a world and to being a human being is arguably the most important set of distinctions in the history of philosophy since Plato. Pragmatists' understanding of words as nodes in a causal network is holistic in the same way Heidegger's unready-to-hand way of being accounts for the interdependent relatedness out of which directedness of our activity emerges. This is illustrated well in Heidegger's example of unready-to-hand coping with a hammer too heavy. A hammer, a piece of equipment, may have some aspect you must cope with. It may be too heavy for this job for you with these nails in this hand in this particular situation. Unlike words used to designate properties like heavy, brown, and so on, here we are designating our moves to arrive at an optimal grip of a situation as it is related to some aspect of our goals, our skills, and our piece of equipment, and so on. It is a totality of involvements. In addition to the pragmatist's view of language as holistic, or meaningful in its relations, they point out, as Heidegger's unready-to-hand does, that descriptions and purposes are interdependent. Rorty argues that elements of language or mind penetrate so deeply into reality that the Cartesian ontotheological tradition of seeing human inquiry as the mapping of something language-independent is fatally compromised from the beginning. Both the words we use and the willingness to use certain words to affirm certain senses using those words and not others are the product of fantastically complex causal connections between humans and the rest of the universe. Heidegger and pragmatists like Rorty, with statements like this, disclose the limitations of our vocabulary by creating new vocabulary. Heidegger does so in such an obvious way with his nothing less than invented terms like Dasein, present, unready, and ready to hand, and Rorty with distinctions meant to reorient us to our perception itself, like made and found, which are meant to dissolve the structuring of epistemological premises by visual analogies. Recent texts such as George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's Philosophy in the Flesh show us just how important it is for mankind to have begun to understand that very structure of reason itself comes from the details of our embodiment. 3 simple assertions. The mind is inherently embodied, though it's mostly unconscious, and abstract concepts are largely metaphorical, have deep and far-reaching impacts, not just for our improving upon our powers of logical inference, but also our ability to conduct inquiry, to solve problems, to evaluate, to criticize, to deliberate about how we should act, and to reach an understanding of others, other people, and the world. Thanks in no small part to the scholarship of Ponty, Heidegger and pragmatists like Donald Davidson and Richard Rorty, the contemporary project is nothing less than re-embodiment for the sake of solidarity and survival. Heidegger opens us to the project with a new vocabulary, disclosing a new way of being for us. He calls this way of being Dasein. First, in this vocabulary, we find the way of being of substances, the present at hand. Second, the way of being of equipment, the ready to hand, and its counterpart, the unready to hand. And last we come to the way of being of people, which Heidegger calls Dasein. Our way of being is a kind of activity. We are what we do. We are coping beings. We are at our most basic always experiencing the fore-opening, fore-closing, fore-sitting of things. In the course of our lives, we are socialized into a world of significance and shared practices and skills, reciprocating in a world of equipment. At various points, we take up certain practices and in so doing, an identity with roles. We become mothers, carpenters, computer programmers, and so on. This way of being, Dasein, is the basic experience in which directed activity is going on, skilling, coping, in order to do something for the sake of some future. We take up a hammer in order to drive a nail, in order to fix something for the sake of being a carpenter or a homeowner or a provider of shelter and so on. This realization of the substances contemplating objects with a quasi-divine faculty reason in pursuit of truth. In so doing, this richer understanding of our being as dynamics of the way of being of substances, equipment, and Dasein undermines what has been referred to as the metaphysics of presence, the search for a full presence beyond the reach of play, absolute beyond the reach of reality. In a world of practical activity, something is what it is in its relations. A hammer only makes sense in a world with nails and wood and houses and carpenters and so on. No matter whether the tool is a hammer, a gun, a belief, a statement, tool using is part of the interaction of the organism with its environment, its attempts to serve its transitory purposes and solve its transitory problems. Heidegger's break with Cartesian condition brings us to a new relation to our beliefs and desires as instances of our doing for the sake of. Beliefs and desires are no longer forces acting out within the Cartesian theater, which is a person's consciousness. They are, Rorty argues, simply tools for coordinating our behavior with those of others. It is not to say that one can reduce mental states such as beliefs and desires to physiological behavioral states. It is to say, in Rorty's view, that there is no point in asking whether our belief represents either mental reality or physical reality accurately. That is, for pragmatists, not only a bad question, but the root of much wasted philosophical energy. In their view, the right question to ask is, for what purposes would it be useful to hold that belief? Another way to make this point is to say that pragmatists cannot make sense of the idea that we should pursue truth for its own sake, that it is a mistake to regard truth as a goal of inquiry. The purpose of inquiry is to achieve agreement between human beings about what to do to bring about certain consensus on goals to be achieved and means to achieve those goals. Inquiry not directed toward coordinating of behavior is not inquiry but wordplay. To argue for a certain theory about the microstructure of material bodies or about the proper balance of power between branches of government is to argue about what we should do, how we should use the tools at our disposal to achieve technological or political progress. And for this reason, for pragmatists, they see no sharp break between social sciences and natural science, or between social science and politics, or between politics, philosophy, and scripture. All areas of culture are part of the same endeavor to make life better. There is no deep split between theory and practice, because so-called theory that is not wordplay is always already practice. To treat beliefs not as representations but as habits of action, to treat words not as representations but as tools, is to make fruitful, to ask, am I discovering or inventing, making or finding? There is no point in dividing up the organism's interaction with the environment in this way. Consider for an example. We are quick to say that a bank account is a social construction rather than an object in the natural world, whereas giraffes is an object of the natural world rather than a social construction. Bank accounts are made, giraffes are found. The truth in this view seems to be that had there been no human beings, there would still be giraffes, whereas there would be no bank accounts. But this causal independence of giraffes from humans does not mean that giraffes are what they are apart from human needs and interests. On the contrary, we describe giraffes in the way that we do as giraffes because of our human needs and interests. We speak a language with the word giraffes because it suits our interests to do so. The same goes for words like atom, cell, and so on, the name of the parts of which a giraffe is made up, so to speak. All the descriptions of the things are descriptions suited to our purposes. No sense can be made, Rorty argues, of the claim that some of these descriptions pick out natural kinds, that they cut nature at the joints. The line between a giraffe and the surrounding air is clear enough for a human being that is hunting for meat. But if you are a language-using ant or amoeba, or a space voyager observing from far above, that line is not so clear. And it is not clear that you would have or need to have a word for giraffe in your language. More generally, it is not clear that any of the millions of ways you could describe the piece of space-time occupied by what we call a giraffe is any closer to the way things are in themselves than any of the others. Just as it is pointless to ask whether a giraffe is really a collection of atoms or really actually possible sensations in human sense organs or really something else. So the question, are we describing it as it really is a question that you never need to ask. All we need to know is whether some competing description would be better for present purposes. The desire to describe a giraffe is only wordplay when it's not directed activity, skilling, coping, in order to do something for the sake of some future. We describe a giraffe in order to protect it from poachers, in order to fulfill my role and obligation as a steward of the natural world for the sake of being a good person, or parent, or successful game warden. Rorty's example explains why the unready to hand illustrates the pragmatist view of the interdependence of descriptions and purposes. The interdependence of descriptions and purposes is the principal argument for the representational view of knowledge, a view maintaining that inquiry aims at utility for us rather than an accurate accounting of how things really are in themselves. This belief about inquiry is better than competing beliefs like the ontological because of its acknowledgement of certain limitations that exist. This belief acknowledges that every belief we make must be formulated in some language or other, and that languages are not attempts to copy what is out there, but rather tools for dealing with what is out there, and as a result, there is no way to break out the contribution made by the object from the contribution made by our subjectivity. As Rorty argues, both the words we use and our willingness to affirm certain senses using those words and not others is as good as inquiry gets. The attempt to push beyond the fantastically complex causal connections between humans and the rest of the universe in philosophy and elsewhere over the past 2,300 years has been much wasted energy in the form of a metaphysics of presence. An attempt to reach an absolute beyond the relative, an attempt to map things language independent, lacking any means to do so. There is no way to divide up this web of causal connections so as to compare the relative amount of subjectivity and objectivity in a given belief. Normativity, better and worse, goes all the way down to the bottom of our perception and all the way up to the fact that every belief we hold to be true only so far as we know. The ontotheological tradition since Plato has shaped the history of man and nature by turning away from the responsibility for the fantastically complex causal connections between man and the universe into wordplay in the form of circular claims to rightness as greater reasonableness. The same way that the causal independence of giraffes from humans does not mean that giraffes are what they are apart from human needs and interests, an accurate account of how things really are in themselves can't help us break out what divides the unjust from the imprudent, the evil from the inexpedient. Claims to greater reasonableness are mere attempts to escape the unstable because fantastically complex choices between competing goods into rightness. Sentiments for guiding action like all members of a species are brothers and sisters are among our more successful means of making choices between competing goods that require no claim to unquestionable finality or absoluteness. Considerations of family membership, sex, race, religious orientation, and the like should not prevent us from trying to do to others as we would have them do to us, should not prevent us from thinking of them as people like ourselves, deserving the respect we ourselves hope to enjoy. The formulation of the sentiment of mutual respect as a firm moral principle each of us feels as deep down binding upon us is something like Kant's understanding of moral obligation. However, the abstraction a firm moral principle amounts to acts as a legitimating principle for moral obligation in the form of prejudice. Not all firm moral principles turn out to be egalitarian. One such principle is that dishonor brought to a woman of one's family must be paid for with blood. Another is that it would be better to have no son than one that is homosexual. Rorty reminds us, for those of us who would like to put an end to the blood feuds and the gay bashing of these firm moral principles, that we cannot claim our egalitarian principles of mutual respect are more rational than those of the blood revengers and the gay bashers. We have no more success with such a claim than we do with the principle, thou shalt not kill. Rorty writes, this is admirably universal, but is more or less rational than the principle, do not kill unless one is a soldier defending one's country, or is preventing a murder, or is a state executioner, or a merciful practitioner of euthanasia. If it is the case that the past 2,300 years has been such a slow, contingent evolutionary development from societies ruled by men to societies ruled by laws because of a representational view of knowledge, what direction does an anti-representational holistic naturalism provide to improve the speed of moral progress? Heidegger and pragmatism snap together nicely in attempting to address this question. Liberalism, in this view, with no universality other than the transient and unstable one which time, luck, and discursive effort might win for it, focuses on discursive effort. Rorty's position is that we have no notion of rational warrant that exceeds or transcends or grounds the norms that liberal intellectuals take to define through open-minded, reflective discussion. At a time when what many feel to be reasonable views of how things are seem clearly unconstrained by how the world actually is, such a conversationalist view of truth and knowledge seems defensible. This state of affairs also reinforces the notion that persuasion across such fundamental differences is achieved, if at all, by concrete comparisons of particular alternatives, by elaborate description and redescription of the kinds of life to which different practices promise us in the way of more equal chances at happiness or a better human future. For the individual, the prescription seems to rely on the argument that we should be content to treat the demands of self-creation and of human solidarity as equally valid, yet having no common standard of measure. What is more, that vocabularies should be developed or created in pursuit of personal fulfillment, self-creation, and self-realization. Heidegger, by way of UC Berkeley's Hubert Dreyfus, offers an example of such a vocabulary. Dreyfus explains his view of a way his students may take up some of what his students may learn. He articulates the character of an orientation to the world where the sentiments, vulnerability, commitment, risk, and meaning express the character with which we must engage the complex adjustments to novel situations and circumstances of which life is made up. For example, when something goes wrong, we try to formulate a rule that says, don't do that sort of thing in that sort of situation again. We then try to follow that rule. Doing so makes you rigid and routine, robot-like, less than flourishing. The alternative is to take on the failings that come with attempting to grasp the gestalt of situations by simply feeling bad about the mistakes and good about what works and dwelling on them, being present to yourself and not regretful. This conscious attempt to stay connected to our embodied ability to grasp meaning is an opening up to a field of significance organized by and for beings like us, within our bodies, desired, interests, and purposes. This is a world apart from the Cartesian Lockean picture of mind trying to get in touch with a reality outside of itself. The challenge is to make more equal chances at happiness, or a better human future, by nothing less than taking up the responsibility of authorship of how the world shows up for us as mattering.